The wind had been restless all day, dragging ribbons of dry snow across the frozen ground until the prairie looked like a quilt someone had pulled too tight. By dusk, the horizon was nothing but a pale seam between the white earth and the bleached winter sky. Alara Boone sat at her small kitchen table, the lamplight throwing long, steady shadows over the walls. A torn wool coat lay across her lap, its frayed seam pinned and ready for the slow work of the needle. She wore her hair in a loose braid down her back, strands falling forward whenever she bent over her stitches. Outside, the world had gone quiet, except for the groan of the wind against the eaves. 8 years of this life had worn her into a shape the land understood, self-contained, plain-spoken, moving at the same unhurried pace as the seasons. She had buried her husband under the cottonwoods before the snowmelt that spring, his lungs too worn to keep breathing, his hands too tired to keep working. Afterward, the silence had settled in and never left. She'd filled it with chores, with the familiar rhythm of tending chickens, cutting wood, hauling water, mending what could be mended. People from town came by only when they needed something, traded a jar of her preserves, a spare tooland left without lingering. She didn't mind. Conversation had become a luxury she didn't require. The coat she worked on belonged to no one but herself, though it had been her husband's once. The stitching was rough in places, where her hands had learned to do a job his used to. She paused to thread the needle again, squinting slightly at the fine eye in the lamplight. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and beeswax from the candle stub burning on the shelf. It was a good night for staying in, for letting the cold wind roam where it pleased while she sat with the warmth of the fire at her back. Then it came, the sound. At first it was faint enough to mistake for the shifting groan of snow-laden branches, but it grew, steady and sure, until the rhythm became unmistakable. Hooves. Not one or two, but many, their cadence heavy and deliberate, muffled slightly by snow yet carrying through the stillness. Her hand stilled over the coat. Riders rarely came this way in winter, and never in numbers. She set the needle in the fabric and rose slowly, listening harder. The sound was closer now, pressing against the edges of her quiet world. She crossed to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to see without letting too much of the lamplight spill out. The white expanse of her yard lay still under the faint glow of a waxing moon. Then shapes emerged from the far edge of the field, dark, broad-shouldered silhouettes atop tall horses. 7 of them, moving in a slow, unified line, steam rising from the animals' nostrils in pale bursts. The figures were heavy in fur and leather, their outlines shifting as they drew nearer. But even before the details came into view, something in the way they rode told her they were not from town. The horses halted at her gate, hooves grinding into the crusted snow. For a moment, no one moved. Alara's breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer. The leader, taller than the rest, turned his head as if surveying the cabin, the barn, the thin line of smoke from her chimney. The wind caught the edge of his fur-lined cloak and snapped it like a sail. She caught a glimpse of paint across one man's face, the sharp line of a braid down another's shoulder. Alara let the curtain fall back into place, her pulse steady but sharpened. Visitors were rare. 7 mounted strangers at night in the dead of winter rarer still. She set the coat aside, crossed to the door, and rested her palm against the worn wood. Outside, the horses shifted, tack creaking, a low murmur of voices in a language she didn't know. She could feel the cold seeping through the doorframe, but it wasn't the weather that made the air feel thinner. They had stopped here, at her gate, and they hadn't come to pass through. The wind hit first, rattling the shutters as if something outside wanted in. Then came the sharp knock, 3 deliberate raps that carried through the walls like the crack of distant gunfire. Alara hesitated, her hand resting on the latch. The riders had been at her gate only minutes ago. Now they were here, their presence pressing against her door like the weight of the storm itself. She opened it halfway, letting the cold slice in, and found herself staring into a line of dark, unblinking eyes. 7 men sat their horses in the yard, steam rising from the animals in thick white breaths. Cloaks of wolf fur hung heavy on their shoulders, dusted with snow. The flicker from her lamp caught streaks of ochre and black paint across faces that looked carved from something older than the land itself. At their head was a man taller than the rest, broad in the saddle, his hair bound in a long braid wrapped with strips of leather. He looked at her steadily, as though measuring not just her shape, but her resolve. "We seek shelter," he said, his voice deep, each word spaced like a stone laid carefully in a river. The English was precise but weighted with an accent that pulled certain vowels low. "Blizzard comes fast." Alara glanced past him to the horizon. The sky had shifted, the pale line at the edge of the plains now swollen with dark, low clouds. She could feel the temperature dropping even from the doorway. Still, she didn't move immediately. Strangers in winter were risk enough. 7 armed men were something else entirely. "How long?" she asked. "Until morning," the man replied. "No trouble." His eyes didn't waver from hers. She opened the door wider. "Leave your weapons by the wall." Her voice was even, but the decision had already been matter practicality over fear. In weather like this, no one stayed outside without courting death, and she had no desire to have 7 corpses frozen in her yard by sunrise. The leader, who she would later know as Tahan, swung down from his horse in one fluid motion. The others followed, dismounting without a word. One by one they unbelted knives, laid rifles and bows against the side of the cabin. The sound of metal and leather on wood was sharp in the cold air. They filed in silently, their presence filling the small room with the scent of smoke, hide, and snow. They spread out around the hearth, not sitting too close, each taking a place as if by some unspoken order. The fire popped, casting shadows across the paint on their faces. Elara moved among them with quiet purpose, stoking the flames, pulling a kettle of water onto the grate. No one spoke. She was aware of their eyes tracking her, not hostile, but watchful in a way that made the air feel narrower. One of them, younger than the rest, sat apart from the others, his long frame folded with easy patience. His hair was tied back with a strip of rawhide, a thin scar running along the edge of his jaw. He didn't stare openly, but whenever she glanced his way, his gaze was already on her, sharp, curious, steady. She felt it even when her back was turned. She ladled out hot water into a tin basin, setting it near the fire for their use. Tahan inclined his head in acknowledgement, but no thanks was spoken aloud. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, carrying the first hiss of snow against the walls. Inside, the heat from the fire crept slowly into the chill that clung to their clothes. The cabin felt smaller than it had in years, yet somehow more alive. The young one's eyes followed her as she moved about, not with the hunger of a man who wanted, but with the attention of one who noticed. Alara kept her own face unreadable, but the truth was clear enough: winter had just become something far less predictable than snow and wind. The room was too quiet for the number of bodies inside it. 7 men sat in a loose half-circle around her hearth, the fire painting the war paint on their faces in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was in low tones in a language she did not know, their voices carrying the weight of things said only when necessary. Even their movements seemed pared down: no wasted gestures, no fidgeting, just stillness, except for the occasional tilt of a head or slow turn of an eye to track her as she moved through the room. Alara kept her hands busy. She fetched the pot from its hook, filled it with water from the bucket, and set it over the flames. A bundle of venison, thawed just enough to cut, lay on the table. She sliced it into even pieces, the knife's rhythm the only sound besides the wind clawing at the walls. Root vegetables followed, dropped into the pot with the meat, along with a pinch of dried sage and salt from her stores. The scent began to rise almost immediately, meat and earth and smoke blending into something that made the air thicker. Her eyes swept over them as she worked. Snow still clung to the hems of their cloaks, melting into small dark puddles on her floorboards. A few bore the marks of travel dust ground into the seams of their boots, frost edging their braids. But there was something else in their appearance, too. Faint streaks of soot along one man's sleeve. A tear in the knee of another's leggings, and on the youngest, Kaya, a dark smudge of dried blood along the fabric of his shirt, just below the left shoulder. She set down the knife and crossed to him without asking. He watched her approach, his gaze level, but didn't move when she knelt beside his chair. The tear in the sleeve was small but wide enough to reveal a shallow cut beneath. The skin around it was swollen, the edges reddened from the cold more than from infection. She fetched a small tin from the shelf, its lid dented from years of use, and scooped a smear of salve onto her fingertips. The smell of pine resin and beeswax rose between them as she worked the ointment gently into the wound. Kaya didn't flinch, though his eyes followed her hands closely. She threaded a needle, her movements as practiced as any other chore, and put in 3 small neat stitches. When she was done, she tied off the thread, pressed the fabric back into place, and smoothed it down. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No words passed between them. Outside, the storm gathered itself. The wind began to scream down from the open plains, rattling the shutters in their frames. Snow hissed against the windows, a ceaseless whisper that built into a roar when the gusts rose. The cabin creaked under the strain, the sound deep in the bones of the building. Alara ladled stew into tin bowls and set them on the table one by one. The men ate slowly, methodically, their eyes flicking up only now and then to mark her movements. The air inside was thick with scents venison and sage, damp wool steaming near the fire, the faint metallic edge of melted snow. It was not the warmth of company but the heaviness of proximity, of strangers bound together by the simple fact of the storm outside and the walls holding it back. Alara sat last, her own bowl cradled in her hands, and listened to the wind as it tried to find its way in. By the time the first light seeped through the shutters, the world beyond the cabin had been swallowed whole. Snow lay in great white drifts, smoothed over by the wind until even the fence posts were nothing but vague humps beneath the surface. The sky was still low and heavy, and the air had that muffled quality that told her the storm wasn't finished yet. Elara stood at the window for a moment, holding her coffee close, watching as the gusts curled over the rise and erased their own tracks before they could be made. The Comanche were already outside, their figures moving dark and deliberate against the pale landscape. No one had told them to work. They simply did. 2 split logs with a steady, unhurried rhythm, stacking the halves neatly by the barn. Others crouched in the lee of the wall, mending leather tack with gloved fingers. One hauled buckets of water from the well, the steam rising from the surface and blowing away into nothing. They worked without the chatter of men filling the hours, without the need to glance around for approval. It was just the business of living, of doing what needed doing, before the cold got the better of them. Kaya was easy to pick out, even at a distance. He worked longer at each task, never seeming to notice when the others switched jobs or stepped inside for warmth. He drove his axe into the log again and again, not with the force of someone showing strength, but with the quiet patience of a man who understood how work stitched the day together. Elara found herself watching him longer than she meant to, her coffee cooling in her hands. When the others drifted back into the cabin, he stayed, carrying in the last of the wood before stamping the snow from his boots and stepping through the door. By midday, the cabin had warmed, the smell of wood smoke clinging to every surface. Elara kept her guard in place. He'd lived too many years alone to let it down easily, but the presence of the men had started to weave itself into the day's pattern. They knew where the water pail was, took turns tending the fire without comment, and kept their gear neatly in the corner she'd set aside. She found the floor swept without her asking, the door mended where the wind had been pushing a draft through a crack in the frame. That evening, she sat at the table under lamplight, a strip of torn fabric spread across her lap. It was Kaya's, again a sleeve that had caught on something sharp, leaving a ragged tear. He stood nearby, leaning against the table's edge, one hip resting lightly against the wood. The room was quiet except for the fire's occasional pop. She bent over the mending, the needle pulling the thread through with a soft hiss. At one point, as she shifted the fabric to set another stitch, her fingers brushed his. It was a small thing, the lightest touch, but it was there a spark passing from skin to skin before either of them moved on. Neither of them looked up. She kept her eyes on the thread, drawing it in tight and neat. He stayed where he was, close enough that she could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the world in white, but inside the cabin, the air had changed in some quiet, unspoken way. The days blurred into one another, each one wrapped in the same muted light that seeped through the winter sky. Morning and afternoon were barely distinguishable, the sun only a pale disk behind the clouds. Inside the cabin, life moved in quiet turns. The men kept to their work without being told, splitting more wood than she could burn in a week, patching a loose shutter, mending a bridle strap with hands that worked leather like it was part of them. In the stillness, Alara began to notice small things, the kind of details that lived in the edges. Tahan, the one who had first spoken at her door, was the eldest and carried it like a mantle. His eyes moved constantly, marking every sound, every shadow, every shift in the wind. He rarely spoke, but when he did, the others listened without question. Peta, broad-shouldered with a quiet humor that showed in the corners of his eyes, would sometimes hum or sing low under his breath while carving. The words were in Comanche, the melody dipping and curling like smoke in still air. It was a sound that made the room feel older, as if the walls themselves remembered it. And then there was Kaya. She had learned he was the youngest among them, though his watchfulness was sharper than the others. He didn't speak much, but his eyes missed nothing, whether it was a draft under the door, a chicken that hadn't returned to its roost, or the way she favored her right arm when carrying the heavier wood. He was never in the way, yet somehow always near enough to notice when something needed doing. The silences in the cabin began to change. At first they had been wall-stall, firm, and meant to keep the unknown at a distance. But now they felt different. Not gone, but softened. A shared space rather than a barrier, the kind of quiet that allowed for presence without demand. She no longer felt the need to fill it, and they didn't either. It was a language in itself. One evening, with the air settling into its deepest chill, Kaya appeared at the door as she was pulling on her coat. She was headed to the creek for water, the buckets hanging from their yoke by the door. He took one without asking, falling into step beside her. The path was narrow, the snow packed by use, the sky above washed in the faint light of a rising moon. Their boots crunched in the snow, the only other sound the steady groan of the bucket handles as they walked. They didn't speak, there was no need. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the wind stalled, the trees standing rigid under their coats of ice. The creek was a black ribbon cut through the white, steam rising where the current kept it from freezing over completely. They filled the buckets in silence, the water sloshing gently, and turned back. As they made their way to the cabin, the weight of the buckets pulled against their arms, their steps falling into the same rhythm. Somewhere between the slow crunch of snow and the faint creak of the handles, something passed between them. It wasn't a look or a touch, just a shared understanding, as real and steady as the cold air in their lungs. When they reached the porch, she set her bucket down first. He did the same, pausing a fraction longer than necessary before stepping inside. Nothing had been said, but something had shifted all the same. The morning came clear for the first time in days. The clouds had split open sometime before dawn, letting a hard, clean light spill across the snow. It was the kind of sunlight that didn't warm, only sharpened the edges of the world, the ridges on the drifts, the long shadows of the cottonwoods, the bright glint on ice-crusted branches. Ilara stepped outside with her coffee, the cold biting at her face, and saw the men moving with a different sort of purpose. They were checking their horses, running gloved hands down legs and over hooves, adjusting saddle straps that had stiffened in the cold. Packs were being opened, gear inspected and repacked. Tahan stood with two others near the barn, speaking low as he tied down a bedroll. The sight of it pulled something taut inside her chest, though she didn't care to name it yet. She'd known they would leave. Storms pass, people move on. Still, the thought of the cabin going quiet again left her feeling as though the air around her had thinned. She found herself at the barn with a hammer in hand, working on a hinge that had been loose for months but never urgent enough to fix. The metal was cold beneath her fingers, the wood groaning softly as she adjusted the pin. A shadow fell across her, and she didn't need to turn to know it was Kaya. Without a word, he stepped closer, holding the hinge steady as she worked. His hands were bare, the skin across his knuckles darkened from cold and work. They moved in a rhythm, her hammering slow and deliberate, his grip sure. When the final nail was set, he didn't move away immediately. "You're not afraid?" he asked, his voice low, careful. His English was better than she'd heard it before, though each word still carried the weight of thought. She looked at him, surprised he'd spoken at all, let alone to ask her that. Afraid of what? Living out here, alone. Her answer came without hesitation. Fear's just another kind of weather, you get used to it. Something shifted in his expression, not amusement exactly, but a flicker of something warmer, almost curious. His mouth curved, just slightly, into the faintest smile she'd seen from him since he arrived. It wasn't meant to charm. It was the kind of smile given when a person recognizes another's truth. They stood there a moment longer, the breath from their mouths curling in the sunlit air, before he finally stepped back. She slid the hammer into her coat pocket and brushed wood shavings from her gloves. Around them, the other men kept working, the sound of horses snorting and leather creaking filling the bright, cold morning. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, the air already cooling. She added a log, listening to the muted sounds of preparation outside. When she glanced out the window again, Kaya was walking back toward the others, his head turning briefly toward the Barnas, if making sure she was still there. The tightening in her chest hadn't eased. If anything, it had rooted in deeper, warm against the cold. It was mid-afternoon when she noticed them. She had gone to the barn for kindling, the light thin and slanting across the snow, when something caught her eye beyond the lower pasturia scatter of indentations in the unbroken white. At first, she thought it might be elk sign, but the spacing was too precise, the lines too clean. Hoofprints. More than a few, heading in from the east. By the time she made it back to the yard, Tahan was already there, standing in the open with his shoulders square and his gaze fixed on the same direction. Two of his men were with him, and without a word exchanged, they peeled away to take up positions, one near the rise that overlooked the creek, the other disappearing toward the stand of cottonwoods. The air seemed to contract, pulling tight against the ribs of the day. From inside the cabin, Alara could hear them speaking in low bursts of Comanche, the cadence sharp in places, almost clipped. She didn't understand most of it, but two words surfaced clearly enough to snag her attention: raiders and settlers patrols. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, a reminder that trouble didn't need to knock before it arrived. The men stayed out longer than usual, scanning the horizon in every direction before returning. No one told her what they had seen or decided. Supper passed in a quieter than usual silence, the kind that had weight to it, as if everyone was measuring the space between words. When she banked the fire for the night, the wind had gone still, but that stillness felt less like peace and more like the pause before something breaks. It was deep into the dark when she woke. The fire had settled to coals, the cabin heavy with the warmth of sleep. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside, the cold wrapping around her like a sudden tide. Kaya stood a few paces from the door, his figure cut against the pale wash of the moon. The snow lit the world in shades of silver and shadow, each drift etched in fine detail. He didn't turn when she approached, only kept his eyes on the far ridge. "You see them?" she asked. "Not now," he said quietly. "But they're close." His voice carried no fear, only the kind of alertness she'd come to recognize in him. Might be looking for us. A pause. Might be looking for you. That can change quick. She studied his profile, the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders seemed ready to move in any direction. You think they'll come here? I think we don't know, he said. And for a moment the only sound was the slow grind of snow under his boots as he shifted his stance. Then he glanced at her, his eyes darker than the sky behind him. If trouble comes, would you trust me? She didn't hesitate. If I didn't, you wouldn't be here. Something eased in his expression, though his gaze went back to the horizon almost immediately. They stood together in the silvered quiet, the snow catching the faint glimmer of moonlight, the night stretched thin between them. Somewhere beyond the ridge, riders moved through the dark. But for now, the only thing that mattered was the unspoken agreement holding in the cold air. The day bled into dusk with a slow, heavy sky, the kind that seemed to press the light out of the air. Alara had just finished covering the woodpile, when the sound came faint at first, a low murmur beneath the wind, then sharper, the unmistakable thud of multiple horses approaching. By the time she reached the porch, the others were already outside, their silhouettes sharp against the pale horizon. The riders emerged from the east, not Comanche. Their coats were heavy, patched with mismatched fur, rifles slung carelessly across their backs. They fanned out as they drew closer, circling the cabin in a slow, deliberate loop, the snow crunching under hooves. One broke off just enough to lean forward in his saddle, his voice carrying through the cold. "Send out the Comanche inside," he called, his tone edged with something that made the hair along Alara's arms rise. Tahan stood a few paces from the porch, one hand resting lightly on the butt of his knife, the other hanging loose at his side. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was a wall in itself. He glanced at his men, a silent command passing between them. They shifted subtle hands near weapons, but not yet drawing them. The air felt thin, as if the cold had stolen more than warmth. Alara stepped forward before she could think better of it. She moved to the doorway, planting herself where they could see her clearly. Kaya was suddenly there at her side, the heat from his shoulder cutting through the chill like a small, defiant fire. "No one here is your concern," she said, her voice carrying enough steel to sound steadier than she felt. A murmur went through the riders, some glancing at each other as if weighing the statement. The one who had spoken laughed without humor. "Everything out here's someone's concern," he said, but he didn't move closer. Kaya didn't speak, but his presence was a constant at her side. She could feel his attention angled partly toward her, partly toward the men outside. Tahan finally spoke then, his voice low but clear. "You've made your pass, keep riding." For a long moment no one moved. The horses shifted, their breath steaming into the dimming light. The intruders studied the Sinith Comanche still as stone, Alara unmoving in the doorway, Kaya's gaze fixed and unblinking. Whatever they saw was enough. The lead rider gave a sharp tug on his reins, turning his horse. The others followed, their formation unraveling as they rode back the way they'd come, their silhouettes swallowed by the falling dark. The cabin exhaled with the wind once they were gone, but the tension didn't lift. Inside, the fire glowed low, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. Tahan spoke quietly to his men, posting a watch at the windows. Kaya stayed near the fire, but he didn't sit like the others. He leaned one shoulder against the wall, eyes tracking Alara as she moved about the room. She felt this steady, unbroken watch, not possessive, not prying, but purposeful. He didn't follow her with words, only with the certainty of someone making sure she was still there, still unharmed. The storm outside had passed without a shot fired, but she could tell by the look in his eyes that they both knew this was only the first ripple of whatever was coming next. The air felt strangely hollow after the riders had gone, as though the cabin itself had been braced for impact and now didn't know what to do with the stillness. Outside, the wind had lost its teeth, drifting lazily over the snow instead of cutting through it. The clouds that had hung low for days began to pull apart, revealing a thin swath of stars. Tehan stood in the yard until the last traces of hoofprints disappeared into the dim horizon, his face unreadable in the fading light. When he came inside, he said only a few words to his men in Comanche, the tone final, like a decision set. Alara didn't need a translation to understand whatever their business was. It had shifted, and this place was no longer part of it. "We leave at first light," he told her in slow, careful English before taking his place by the fire. There was no explanation, but there didn't need to be. She simply nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the thought. That night, the cabin felt different. The usual quiet was still there, but it was softened, almost companionable. The men ate in a loose circle, passing the pot of beans and roasted meat without the guarded glances that had marked the first nights. Even Peda's low humming seemed to hold a gentler note, the kind that settled into the edges of a room instead of filling it. Ilara sat among them, not quite part of their circle but no longer outside of it either. She noticed small exchanges, the brief meeting of eyes between two men as one passed the bread, the slight curve of Tahan's mouth when Peda's song dipped into a familiar refrain. They were still strangers, but the sharp edges between them had worn down, if only for the night. When the meal was done and the fire had burned lower, one by one the men stretched out on their bedrolls, murmuring a few last words before sleep claimed them. The air grew quieter, the soft breath of sleeping bodies mingling with the faint hiss of the wind at the eaves. Kaya lingered. He sat near the fire, elbows resting loosely on his knees, watching the flames as if they might tell him something worth knowing. Alara was tidying the table, stacking bowls when he spoke. "You will be all right?" The words were halting, his accent touching the edges of each syllable. "Yes," she said too quickly. She didn't look up, but she felt the lie settle between them like a thin layer of frost. When she did glance over, his gaze was fixed on her face, studying it in that quiet, unblinking way of his. "You have more courage," he said slowly, "than anyone I know." She gave a small, almost rueful smile. "Courage," she replied, "is just staying put when the wind says run." Something passed across his face, then not quite a smile, but a flicker of understanding, maybe even respect. He didn't answer, just nodded once, as if tucking the words away for later. They sat in silence after that, the kind that no longer felt like a wall. The fire sank to embers, and still neither moved, both knowing that by morning the cabin would lose 7 shadows, and the snow outside would be marked only by the trail of their leaving. The morning came without hurry, spilling a soft gold light over the drifts as though the sun itself had decided to be gentle for once. Frost clung to the edges of the window panes, the patterns delicate as lace. Ilara stood at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, listening to the muffled sounds outside, the muted thud of boots on packed snow, the creak of saddle leather, the low, steady murmur of voices in Comanche. She stepped to the doorway, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The air was sharp, the kind that carried every sound clean and clear. The men were mounted already, their horses shifting beneath them, hooves crunching into the crusted snow. Breath steamed from both man and animal, hanging briefly in the cold before being carried off by the faintest breeze. Tahan sat his horse like a man carved from the same wood as his saddle, his posture easy but unyielding. When his gaze found hers, he inclined his head in a single, deliberate nod. No words passed between them, but the meaning was their acknowledgement, and perhaps a measure of gratitude he didn't dress in speech. Her eyes found Kaya next, and for a moment it seemed he might simply ride on. He guided his horse forward, the others beginning to turn toward the open stretch of white beyond the yard. Then he slowed, stopping just short of where she stood. From the saddle, he leaned down, his shadow falling over her in the pale light. His hand reached for hers without hesitation, and before she could question it, he pressed something into her palm. The leather was worn smooth under her fingers, the weight of the small carved bone light but solid. It was warm from his hand, the heat sinking into her skin. "If you ever need," he said, his voice low and certain, each word shaped with care. She looked down at the tocana, a simple piece of bone, carved with a pattern she didn't know, strung on a narrow loop of leather. When she looked up again, his eyes were steady on hers, dark and unreadable, and then he was straightening in the saddle. The moment passed like a breath. He gave her the smallest nod before turning his horse to follow the others. The sound of hooves filled the yard, the cadence steady, growing fainter as they headed toward the horizon. Snowflakes, light as ash, had begun to drift down again, settling briefly on the dark shapes before vanishing into the sunlit air. Ilara stayed where she was, the cold biting at her cheeks, her fingers curled around the token. She watched until the last rider became a dark speck against the white, until even that was gone and only the wide emptiness of the plains remained. She could still feel the warmth in her palm, small but insistent. For years, her life had been bounded by the walls of her cabin, by the fence line, by the steady cycle of work and silence. Now, standing alone in the yard, she felt the shape of something else connection, however fragile, stretching out beyond the horizon. For the first time in a long while, the life she carried no longer felt like it belonged solely to her.